Okay. Okay, so thank you everybody for the launch of this Imagining Futures Dialogues, which we're very excited about. It's a very kind of non-formal way of us to have really good conversations and some maybe dealing with challenging subjects about some of the things that our projects are raising or have raised, and especially around egalitarian archival practice. So I want to thank not just the presenters, but also people who have agreed to respond, and all the guests and everybody who's made these dialogues and the Imagining Futures possible. I myself am Elena Saev. I'm based at the University of Exeter, and I have the joy of leading the team of Imagining Futures through Unarchived Pasts. And we're a project that goes from 2020 to now 2024. And what we try to do in Imagining Futures, as some of you will know, concerns the issue of who gets to be remembered and what gets to be remembered into the future and how. So it's really about the power of the archive, both as process and as object. And we understand archive in the broadest possible sense, and also challenge the notion of what perhaps the archive means. And what we're trying to do together is work towards a manifesto of egalitarian archival practices. And we try to do this when we're funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So that's all I'm going to really say about the project itself. And I think the presentation will speak for themselves. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So just very quickly about the format. I'm going to give very brief introductions to our speakers and respondents. Then we're going to have about 10-minute presentations with a 5-minute maximum response. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussions for each speaker. So if you'd like to ask any questions, you can either raise your hands or you put your question in the Q&A. And if the connectivity is bad, we might need to switch off our videos. So if anybody's having bad connectivity and you're struggling, please do just let us know in the chat and we'll try and do that. Also, I'm going to just put a message in the chat, which I'll put in several times, just for anyone who may want to know about future events, who isn't part of the Imagining Futures main team at the moment, and also how you find out about our project a little more. And a very special welcome to people who've joined us literally from all around the world in many, many time zones. So I appreciate in some places it's quite late and in others it's quite early. And I'm really grateful for you taking the time to join us in these discussions. Okay, so without further ado, I'm just going to put this in the chat so people know what's going on. And so today's presentations to launch this will be from Tawny and also Anthonia Mnkama. And we're going to start off with Tawny, and her respondent will be Howayda al-Harithy. And then we're going to go on to Anthonia Mnkama, whose respondent will be Lenan Mishi. So without further ado, Tawny I was just going to give very brief introductions, and just to say that everybody has very, very rich CVs. So we cannot possibly cover everything. So some of this dynamism you will get through the presentations. But Tawny is a social and economic historian of Britain and the Atlantic world, and her research concerns the history of capitalism, poverty, and debt labor, as well as incarceration. And she's currently the director of the Public History Initiative at UCLA. With Imagining Futures, her team is investigating history in the streets, along with the In Search of LA project. And this addresses the city as a physical archive. And her respondent will be Lenan Mishi, who's based in the Howayda al-Harithy. Sorry, Howayda.
Okay.
And Howayda is based at the Architecture and Urban Design at the American University of Beirut, where she's one of the founding members also of the Beirut Urban Lab, among many other things. And her research focuses on urban heritage practice and theory in relation to identity building and post-war reconstruction in the Arab world. And her current work conceptualizes urban recovery relating to the process of historical editing, urban trauma, and protracted displacement, which is also very much on the ground in Lebanon, considering what is going on there at the moment. So Tawny, over to you if you'd like to share your screen.
Great. So you should be able to see it now. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So this is some research that I started just last year that's kind of fresh, and I've been trying to write it up into an article. So that's what was circulated before this. I realize that most of you may not have had a chance to read it, so I'm gonna just go over what the kind of main points are that I'm working with right now, and really happy for any suggestions or comments either as part of this discussion or if you want to email me later. My email's here. All right, so I think that when most people think of LA, this is probably the kinds of image that they have in mind. This is a city that's very associated with the car. We spend a lot of time in our cars. We spend a lot of time stuck in traffic and in these street spaces. And these streets are some of the most mundane spaces of our everyday lives. But the premise of my project is that we not think of them as kind of empty space, but that we think of streets as commemorative space. And that's because we give these spaces names. And those names have a practical purpose. They help us to navigate, but they also serve a commemorative purpose. Many streets are named after people or after events. And by embedding these names in our everyday lives, they legitimize certain versions of the past. So most people probably don't spend very much time thinking about the meaning behind the names of their streets. But this is actually what makes them so powerful, because they're kind of part of a collective unconscious. So the purpose of my project is to think about the nature of street names as forms of commemoration, to think about the ways in which they operate, the power that they have, and their relationships to the communities of people who live in the spaces that they mark. So the link with archives here is a little bit tenuous, but really what we're thinking about is who gets remembered and what gets remembered and how we can think of the physical space of the city as a kind of archive to get at that question. So these are some of the central questions that I'm asking in the project. And what I'd like to talk about today is actually 3 case studies that I've been working on of street renamings. So instances where streets have been, the name has been changed. And I'm not so much interested in the change as my focus of study, but what that change brings up. People don't tend to talk about why streets are important to them, why street names are important to them, but these moments of name change are kind of moments of rupture, where people come out of the woodwork. As soon as their street name is ready to change, they'll come out of the woodwork and talk about why this street name is so important and what it means to them. So we get a lot of evidence around these moments. So I'm looking at the change of a street called Santa Barbara Boulevard to Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, which is located in South Central Los Angeles in a very historically Black neighborhood. I've been looking at an incident from the 90s from East Los Angeles, which is now a very Latino heavy neighborhood. A change from Brooklyn Avenue to Cesar E. Chavez Avenue. And Cesar Chavez, for those of you who don't know, was a labor activist who really agitated for the rights of farm workers, and has become a really important symbol of civil rights in the Latino communities across the United States. And then changing Rodeo Street to Obama Boulevard in 2017. So what I'll do is just present 3 kind of major points or themes that I'm thinking about as I've studied these different moments of street name change. So my first point is that street names represent values and identities through reference to the past. Street names have deep representative value for people who inhabit the spaces that they label. So in other words, who we name streets after signals something about who we are and what we value. And we can see this playing out both within communities and outside of communities. So outside of communities, this can be about external virtue signaling. In other words, the names of our streets project something about how we want to be seen. And this is really apparent in the renaming of MLK Boulevard, which happens leading up to the 1984 Olympics. And city leaders felt that changing the name of the street to MLK Boulevard would become a symbol of the city's commitment to peace and justice, while international eyes were on Los Angeles because of the Olympics. So here, a place name served as a kind of marker of the city's commitment to justice and of prestige. And then street naming can also serve as a prestige marker because commemorative street naming is a very public act. So after naming Obama Boulevard, the LA City Council presented a statement claiming that through the name change, the city was, quote, publicly documenting what Obama's legacy as our nation's first Black president means to our city and our South Los Angeles community. So here's an effort to really define how the city is being seen through the names of its streets and the people that those streets commemorate. But I think that commemorative street naming actually has its strongest representational value within communities themselves. So how a street name reflects something to the community that it's actually in. And I think this is best represented with the case of Cesar Chavez Avenue, where there's a very strong link between the changing demographics of the neighborhood where the street is located and the renaming of the street. So Chavez Avenue is in a neighborhood called Boyle Heights, which is in East Los Angeles. So here on the map, you can see this is downtown, and here's the neighborhood of Boyle Heights. And this is a neighborhood with a really colorful history. Historically, it was part of unincorporated Los Angeles. So in the early 20th century, there were land use laws called covenants, which were racially restrictive. And basically these were contracts that property owners could put on a piece of property that barred purchasers from selling or renting to individuals based on their race or religion or national origin. So huge communities of people, including Jews, Black communities, Japanese communities, as well as others, were prevented from owning property or living within the city of Los Angeles. And so at the time, the boundaries of the city were with the river here. And so this area directly adjacent to the river became a place where a lot of those people who were barred from the city ended up moving. And so as a consequence, this was a very diverse area. It was very Jewish for a period of time. It was very Japanese for a period of time. But the demographics have shifted quite a lot since the 1950s, and it's now about 94% Latino. So renaming from Brooklyn Avenue to Chavez Avenue happened at the end of this series of demographic shifts. And it was really about the Latino community, who now were a predominant presence in the area, kind of claiming that space and choosing a historical figure that represented them to name the main street running through the neighborhood. And it was also about increasing Latino presence within Los Angeles leadership. When the first Latinx woman became a city councilor, that's when this name was changed. So there's a kind of regime change power dynamic within city government that accompanied this name change to Chavez Avenue. So here, I think, is a very clear link between history, identity, and the politics of representation. But it also meant leaving other people out, because for the Jewish and Japanese communities who used to live in the neighborhood, this street name was part of their history that they felt was being erased. And that's something that I'll come back to in a couple of minutes. Okay, so this idea of like representation and history being very connected to representation through street names is one of the major themes of my project. Another is that street names have layered meanings. So I could do a survey of the streets in LA. I could tell you how many are named after women, how many are named after Mexican leaders, and so on. And that wouldn't even begin to convey the commemorative power that the names of these spaces have, because it runs much deeper and it changes over time. Street names acquire commemorative representational value, even when their original names weren't intended to do so. The geographer Reuben Rose Redwood argues that all street names are commemorative, and I think there's some truth to that. And I'll explain this through two of my case studies. So first is the change from Santa Barbara Avenue to Martin Luther King Boulevard. Santa Barbara Avenue, we don't really know why it was named originally, but it is clear that over time, for the Latino community who lived in that neighborhood, it came to represent their Spanish heritage. So when the name change was proposed, there was a lot of pushback from the community claiming that their heritage was being erased with the name changed to MLK. And so the LA Times reported one quote where a neighborhood resident said, if the street name were changed to Dr. King, the area would take on an unrepresentative Black image. And then back to this Brooklyn Avenue to Chavez Avenue change. Brooklyn Avenue actually was not named after Brooklyn, New York. It was named after the development corporation who developed the area and parceled out the pieces of land that would become the neighborhood. But over time, the name Brooklyn came to be associated especially with the Jewish heritage of the neighborhood, because many people had immigration paths that led through Brooklyn, New York. So the neighborhood came to believe that that's what the name meant, and it took on this commemorative power, even though it was never intended to commemorate originally. So I think this is a really powerful example of the meanings that street names take on in a kind of organic way over time. And I'll give you, because I'm running short on time here, just one last thing that I'm thinking about, and that's that street naming as commemoration involves erasure, right? So first of all, any act of commemoration is also an act of forgetting. When we monumentalize, we're choosing one person over others. We're choosing one past over others. But this is especially true in cases of street renaming, when one person is, or one event is decommemorated and replaced with another. But in a more complex way, there are these different layers of erasure that are taking place. Monumentalizing can actually obscure aspects of the person being commemorated. There's a lot of concern in the United States about the repeated commemoration of Martin Luther King Jr. through street names and statues and monuments, and how this ubiquity has had the unattended effect of kind of sanitizing King's image and legacy, perhaps washing over some of his more radical political and economic ideas by making him more kind of ordinary. And furthermore, the politics of erasure are not only about who is remembered, but where they're remembered. In the Obama street naming case that I've looked at, there was a lot of concern that the street that was being named wasn't big enough, that it wasn't significant enough, but also about the optics of what it looked like because it was in a Black neighborhood. So there's this way in which, you know, you go to a city in the United States and wherever MLK Boulevard is, you know that that's the Black neighborhood. And so are we kind of re-entrenching these issues of spatial segregation through commemoration in a way that I think can potentially involve erasure? Okay, so I'll go ahead and end there, and maybe add just one more thing, which is that there's a lot of attention right now on issues of commemoration and naming, But in America, the attention is primarily on statues and monuments. And I think one of the things that my project is revealing is that street names really need to be part of that dialogue as well, because they're such an important part of how we commemorate the past and how we commemorate the past in a very ordinary, everyday kind of way.
Thank you so much, Tawny. That was incredibly rich. And I think we move straight on to Howayda's response for that.
Thank you, Tony, so much. That was really, really wonderful and thought-provocative. And I'm going to react to what I heard in my designated 5 minutes. And so I may miss out on some of the things. But I want to first talk about what you lay out from a more of a semiotic viewpoint, that place naming becomes a figurative reference to a set of values. It's what semioticians call twice removed, so there is a name of a person who stands for a narrative, a historical event, or a set of values. And the fact that it's twice removed open up the space of interpretation. And I think this is wonderfully exacerbated by the fact that these are public spaces with place names, and the fact that they are accessible to all, used by all, makes the interpretive factor multiplied, right? And the plurality of possible interpretations grow as people consume these names. So I just wanted to raise, if the city is an archives, but it's a public archives being consumed by everyday sociospatial practices, then we are talking about a representation that's not only twice removed, but multitude of times removed. And I really think this is part of kind of, I don't want to call it egalitarian, but opening up, the reading of this system of archives by the general public. But at the same time, you're giving us this wonderful kind of tension between publicness of this archives and its physical, tangible presence as an inscription in the public place and accessibility by all, by this notion of self-representation, how communities see these names and take ownership of them as archives of self-representation rather than for public consumption. And I think this tension is wonderful. In how you presented, especially the changes of names and the shift in scale from the public, national, global to community spaces, in which the names and what they carry is not just a mere kind of sustaining of a memory, but rather a self-representation. And this is a very private act by a small group or a small community that counters the publicness of it. So I want to point out here that what we are then looking at is moral ownership, how people take moral ownership and claim and reclaim spaces and their names in the construction of their identity. And I think this is the kind of the dialectic triangulation that we talked about between object, memory, and ownership, right? It's very well known in heritage studies to play with this triadic of ownership, identity, and memory. And I think we're seeing a similar kind of play here, not only a semiotic play and politics of representation, but there is a play of heritage construction, identity construction, and a claim of that public space through its naming. I'm just kind of trying to reverse this whole process of what does it mean to throw in an archive in the public domain, which does not stop the act of claim and self-representation. We saw that in Beirut downtown, despite the reconstruction project by Solidaire and the kind of elitist exclusive spaces that were produced, that were immediately claimed by the revolution. People going there, putting tents, inscribing graffiti, performing artistic theatrical performances to claim the space and to counter the kind of proposition that was put by Solidaire. So I'm just talking about this wonderful tension that you've raised between publicness of an archive and a self-representation by a private or a small community. Thank you. I hope this helps you think it through further and maybe open the discussion as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Howayda. Tawny, unless you have an immediate response to anything, perhaps we collect a few questions first, yeah?
Sure.
I don't know. Yeah, great. That's a wonderful start. Katie, I know that you've put in something into the chat. Did you want to say something around that? Because that sounds a good way to link. And then Laura, if you go after that.
Yeah, thank you. So the story that I've been looking at, I think, is from the point of view of what Tawny was saying about people being feeling like their history is being taken away, that it's very much someone who associates their memory to places and has left the country, has now come back to the country, and those places aren't there anymore. So it's thinking about what happens to those memories if the place isn't there. So I think a very kind of personal side to what Tawny was talking about as a much kind of wider social view. I don't know if you want me to ask any more about that. But.
I mean, I guess maybe if I just respond really quickly, I think one of the reasons why street names have been really interesting to me is because of all of the different layers of community that they intersect with, or layers of kind of memory. So they're at once like referencing national histories, local histories, community histories, but also, right down to the very personal. I think if you ask almost anyone what the street name was, what the name of the street that they grew up on was, they'll remember that and have some sort of emotional attachment to it. And I think, a lot of people who I've talked to feel that if that street name were taken away, that would erase part of their personal history somehow. So these street names kind of bisect, the personal, the local, the ethnic, the national in these really interesting ways.
Thanks very much. Could just everybody who speaks, could you just say who you are, maybe just very quickly? So Katie, maybe just say who you are, and then we'll go on to Laura and then Akil. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm Katie Brown. I am a lecturer in Latin American Studies at Exeter. So I found out about all of this wonderfulness through Lena.
Okay, Laura.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Matacoro, and I'm a historian in Ottawa, Canada, based at Carleton University. And I'm sorry I had to keep my video off. I have been having technical difficulties this morning. But Tawny, I just want to say how much I enjoyed both the paper and the talk. And I think I'm super excited to see where the project goes, especially because of Katie's response. I think it's nice to think about how these questions actually play out in a number of different contexts. And so when I was reading the paper, and I admit I did do it quickly, I was thinking about it. I mean, we've been having the same conversations here in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, where we have roads named after the first Prime Minister of Canada, who's was involved in the genocide of Indigenous peoples with residential schools. So the debates are fraught. But what's interesting is that Ottawa is not only the capital city, but it's also a local city. People live here and make their homes and communities here. And so I wondered, what I found myself wondering about in the LA context was the way that people have imagined the city of Los Angeles historically. It has meant different things to different people. I understand it's not the capital city, right, of this state, but I was curious to know more about that larger city context and the ways in which it might actually be informing the investment that people have in particular street names and communities, but also their investment in what the city is meant to be. So I don't know if you can say anything about that, but I was curious, just given the current context that I've been living and thinking through. Thank you.
Tawny, did you want to just respond to that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think the kind of, very international, very changing nature of the city is part of this. There's a lot of, kind of constant demographic change and flux happening in these spaces. And naming streets seems to be part of like that dynamic. But there's also this way in which historic street names mark out what was deemed important to commemorate during certain moments of time. So the best example I have of that is that the downtown area is in this grid pattern of streets, and the first map that was drawn of LA, they named the streets, and they named the streets running north-south after Mexican era governors and east-west after American presidents. And this was right after California, which was once part of Mexico, had become American and was kind of working out its, dual heritage. And so honoring that heritage through street names was seen as the most appropriate thing to do. So, nowadays that's a very kind of bygone era, but that way of thinking about heritage has been marked in the streets in a way that I think is really kind of suggestive of this local context maybe that you're talking about.
Thanks. Akil?
Hi, my name is Aqil Abdullah. I'm a lecturer in culture, media, and creative industries at King's College London, and I'm also involved in Imagine Futures through a project that hopefully I will tell you about in a month or so, a couple of months. So an anecdote leading to the question first. I remember very vividly when one time, I'm from Latakia in Syria, and I remember one time before leaving Latakia, I was doing a kind of official paper in a government department, and they gave me an address for somewhere to go to, and it was in Kuwait Street. And I was very confused. I lived in Latakia most of my life, never heard of this street. And then I realized that this is where I live. And the reason for that confusion is that municipalities in Syria have this silly system of giving official names to streets, and these names do not reflect the names used by people. So everyone in Latakia knows my street as Mashru' Shreta. No one, and by no one I mean no one, knows what Kuwait Street is. And yeah, it's where I lived for over 20 years. So no one really gives attention in Latakia to the official namings. And I was wondering if this is something you've come across with the name changes. Do people cling on to the original name? Obviously, this is different because the official names in Syria come after the historic name that everyone uses, and they are in complete disconnection to the demographics and what people think about. But in the case of the examples that you mentioned, they came, at least in theory, as a response to something like reflecting the demographics in one way or another. But still, maybe, I don't know if these changes are being translated into real everyday life for people, for locals.
Yeah, that's such a great example. Thank you for sharing that. And it reminds me that, this story is to some extent local, as Laura pointed out, but also a lot of this is, I think, very universal. One of the reasons why I started this project is because I was going to meet a community partner in Boyle Heights, and she said, meet me at, and gave me the address on Brooklyn Avenue. And I was like, wait, Vivian, Brooklyn Avenue doesn't exist. And she goes, oh, well, now they call it Cesar Chavez. And so this name change happened in the 90s. And people still, now almost 30 years later, refuse to call it by the new name as this, and it's more than just, this is what I was used to. I think it's a really active form of protest about, claiming space and claiming history. So I've definitely seen that. And I think it's such an interesting dynamic and kind of, brings up some issues about power. Who has the power to rename streets? This is a very official process. It's a very bureaucratic process. But then, the pushback to that is to like refuse that name change on a more local level.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Tawny. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Because in the meantime, maybe I'll ask you something about the forgetting. So in terms of places where there's multiple layers of the history, which most places are, if we consider most places as intersections, and we see streets as a pause in the mobility that moves through those intersections, inevitably those pauses will change. And the way what you talk about the demographics is to me like a pause. Okay, why are we picking this pause? Which ones have been skipped? Which ones have been written over? So my question is a little bit about if we accept this as the norm, at what point is it all right to forget? Because we can't possibly remember everything. So, I mean, you wonderfully brought out in the article and in your presentation, these kind of tensions that go through these moments. But if we think of forgetting or renaming, can it ever be a positive something that we strive towards, where there is a celebration? And I mean, not just for one group, but I don't know if there's a way to kind of get both other than refusing to rename.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of mirrors the dynamics around statues and removal in some ways, right? That there is an idea that street names are very, very permanent things. In fact, they're not very permanent things. Street names change all the time. Statues are removed all the time. And these are not kind of, long lasting permanent vestiges of the past. They are memorials, which means that somebody at some point in time has put them there thinking that they represent some sort of value or tradition that they want to mark out in physical space. But I think there's a real, talking about tensions and disconnects, there's a real disconnect between how we as a public think about the permanence of these names and the reality of their actual impermanence. I don't know, that's kind of a really roundabout way of answering your question.
I wonder, just maybe to the rest of the group, I mean, all of you, some of you have lived in very dramatic moments of changing of names and historical moments. And I would love to hear from some of you if there's ever been any kind of creative way of doing this. So I don't know, maybe having a street name where the old one is crossed out, but is kept as part of the street name labels or something like that, or something previously known as. Could I invite other people or maybe, but Rabia, that would be great. And just introduce who you are as well. That would be great.
Great. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm not going to turn my video on. My Wi-Fi has been acting up today.
That's all right.
But so I am part of the Imagining Futures project based at Stellenbosch University at the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest. And I'm a master's student in the arts department. And so in South Africa, we've had to deal with changing street names from apartheid to post-apartheid. And even now, street names are constantly being changed to be more representative of more, I won't say relevant, but I guess more contemporary people. And you can also suggest street names. So you can suggest names for different streets. And what you see in a lot of, and what I've seen this a lot more in small towns, I've seen it remain in small towns, I should rather say, where you'll have the old street name on a yellow block with a red line going through it, and then you'll have the new street name on a white block above it. And so I've always found that the use of color was really interesting. So white being the one that we use, yellow being the one that we're fading out or removing from our street vocabulary, and then the red line through it as well. And you see them sometimes in the cities when street names get changed, but they don't last as long. And yeah, I often do a drive, or my family and I often drive from Gauteng to the Western Cape. And so that means we go through a lot of the small, more inland towns. And that's when you really do see a lot of these street name changes.
Thank you for that insight, Rabia. Tawny, did you want to have kind of the last word before we move on to the next presentation? That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways now where when there's an idea that, you know, a street needs to be renamed after an important figure, that they kind of add on underneath the official street name. There'll be like a sort of brown historic sign that's like, you know, whoever Memorial Avenue. But I think kind of as a response to the idea that changing a street name is actually a huge bureaucratic hassle for a lot of people. Like suddenly all of the businesses have to change their addresses, you know, so there's an effort to kind of appease that practical side by just adding on. But I'm not sure that that does the same thing as changing the official name, because this all has to do with how people refer to it and how they think about it. And so when something is kind of officially unofficial, I don't know that it has the same power.
I think,
Wait, go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I have to interject and just note also the greater problematic of occupation and how countries change names of people in their own neighborhoods and cities, such as what we're witnessing in Israel, a complete claim of street names and erasure of history, even for the living memory of people who still inhabit these spaces. It's not just the villages that have been wiped out and new settlements built, but it's actually of neighborhoods that still are living neighborhoods with the same social and economic networks and demographics, and still the inscription of new names is a form of occupation. So it's not always, you know, what the examples Tony are giving us are great, because they are from the community as grassroots that represent changes and part of self-representation. We also have the opposite, you know, and in Syria and many other places, we also have the superimposition of names that celebrate figures that we don't necessarily think are heroes. But I think the extreme is place naming as a tool of occupation. I just wanted to note that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Howayda. And can I just point you to the chat as well, where there's another kind of line of discussion going on that we can't pick up immediately now, but maybe if there's a related theme after the next presentation, we come back to that. But thank you very much. And just an applause for Tony for presenting this wonderful project, and for Howayda for getting us onto the direction of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. We look forward to see where this all goes. And so for the next project, going into a very different part of the world and a slightly different theme, but raises issues also about change and tradition. Anthonia Mnkama, and Anthonia, if you could put your camera on, if you've got good connectivity, that would be great. Thanks.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anthonia. And Anthonia is currently Assistant Education Officer at the National Museum of Tanzania. She's also the founder and coordinator of the Humanities Cultural Festival, currently known as UDOM, and the founder of Tourism, a Tremendous Team, which is a wonderful name, a group that deals with cultural heritage awareness, environmental protection, and tourism education in schools and universities. She's now doing a master's on tourism management at Beijing International Studies University and specializes on cultural tourism and promotion. And with Imagining Future, she's investigating traditional storytelling as an archive under threat, with school children to learn how they understand and engage with African oral tradition. And responding to Anthonia will be Lennon Mishi. And Lennon, I don't know if you can possibly maybe turn on your video for a minute. That would be great. Thanks. And Lennon is an anthropologist whose interdisciplinary work spans, just trying to let people in at the same time, spans interests in Africa and its diasporas, the afterlives of slavery and colonialism, and the approaches to contemporary forms of exploitation, forced labor, and human rights in different African countries. Currently, he's a researcher at the Pitt Rivers Museum on the project Reconnecting Objects, Epistemic Plurality, and Transformative Practices in and Beyond Museums. And he's also part of the Anti-Slavery Knowledge Network at the University of Liverpool, working on how creative art and heritage-based community-led approaches can be utilized in confronting contemporary forms of exploitation. So Anthonia, I'm just going to share your slides, and then you just let me know when to move that. Thanks. I'm just going to get rid of that. Sorry, just give me a second. Okay. Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you guys. And as Elena introduced me, my name is Anthonia Mnkama from Tanzania. And I'll start my presentation. My title is Traditional Storytelling as an Archive and a Threat. And it was done with the school students from Dar es Salaam, Kinondoni, Manispo. And the keywords of my research will be traditional storytelling, cultural heritage, and children. So I'll be connecting, there'll be connection between traditional storytelling, cultural heritage, as well as children. So children, traditional storytelling, and cultural heritage explore how everyday experiences of children and their imaginative and creative words, which are collected, interpreted, and displayed in their daily lives. So I'm sorry, excuse me, Elena. I'm using my computer, so maybe you should go to the next slide.
Anthonia, just say next whenever you need me to go to. That's great. There you go.
Okay, next. So those are my keywords. Then the next slide. So children, traditional storytelling and cultural heritage, it explores how everyday experiences of children and the imaginative and creative words, which are collected, interpreted, and displayed in their daily lives. Next slide. So the first part is cultural heritage and children. So heritage and culture always plays a critical role in shaping the overall personality and character of a child. So this is why, apart from our regular education that they get from school, exposure to the right cultural environment is also a must. And it helps to groom the kids into better human beings. And the cross-country boundaries are shrinking, and the cultures are positively getting influenced through the exchange and social interactions. So the grooming of kids into their original culture or their actual culture, it's a very nice thing to help them grow into great human beings, and it will help them to cope with their own environment and not the imaginative environment of which many children have nowadays due to their change in the globalization, whereby they watch lots of movies, lots of cartoons, they hear different stories of different people which are not in their actual environment. So helping them learn their own cultures through storytelling will help them grow and maybe cope with everything that will face them in their actual environment. Next slide. So storytelling and children. So what do I mean by storytelling? It is not about reading books, retelling traditional tales, or even adapting to a well-known story. I'm talking about developing a children's creativity and giving them the skills to confidently share their stories based on the interests and the things that are familiar to them and the things that were faced by their elders in different periods of time, and the acts of lessons and bridge to self-development. Most of the stories that elders are narrating to their kids are what happened in their actual environment, what happened to them, or what happened to their elders. It might be a lesson or a motivation to a child on what to do or how to do it and what not to do. So there are lessons that will help them like adapting to their familiar environment. Next slide. So this is a picture of a children telling stories during my research. So children and cultural heritage. Children learn about themselves and construct their own identity within the context, of their families and communities. So in early childhood setting, children develop a sense of belonging where they feel accepted, develop attachment, and trust those that care for them. And this can be proved by the Pigot's period of cognitive development. It's a research that was done by Pigot about children and how they adapt to the environment. Like different periods, from birth to 2 years, 2 years to 6 years, 7 to 11 years, 12 to adulthood. So it is Pigot's like advice that children has to be groomed from the early stages of development. It's when they develop sensory motors that they uses the sensory motors to know different items, but also it's a pre-operational stage where the symbolic thinking, language use, and egocentric thinking grows. They grow their imagination, they grow their experience, and like they know what they're supposed to do at that age. So it is best to groom them before they become adults, because it's where they develop the sense and they start of like practicing what they are told. And that's why I was interested in dealing with children most, to understand if they know, and also to tell them what they are supposed to do. I'll show you guys on my objectives. So the next slide, children and storytelling. Another slide. Yeah, children deserves the best chance to become happy adults. And to enable this, they must be able to build good relationship, develop health, self-confidence, and have perseverance required to take on difficult tasks. So when children develop the ability to orally share their stories with friends and teachers, they're building skills such as creativity, language development, communication skills, social skills, and confidence. So storytelling, it's not only about sharing stories. It's a lot of things that have been packed in one package that will help. It will help to groom the kid to become a better adult. And the next slide, please. So justification of my research. As the purpose of this research was to evaluate the children's understanding of cultural heritage through traditional storytelling, rather than the ability to recall and retell the stories. Also, the data collection comprised in-depth interview with children, parents, teachers, and education officers. And with a sample of 70 children from 3 schools of Msasani B, Mikocheni, and Ushindi Primary School, 8 teachers, 12 parents, and 1 education officer, the hypothesis was tested. So next slide, objectives of the study. The first objective is to test the children's understanding of traditional storytelling as one of the archives that is under threat. And education officers support, whether education officers support traditional storytelling in curriculum preparation and practices, but also to know whether teachers, guardians, or parents nurture their children towards the use of traditional storytelling, but also to archive the stories that children narrated in an archive for future reference. Those were my objectives. So the findings from children. Each child was given an opportunity to narrate their stories, readers, or sing a traditional song that were once narrated or sung to them by their teachers, guardians, or parents, and share the lessons learned from the stories with their fellow students. So it wasn't only about narrating and telling us, it was a lot of things, the memory, the social skills, the confidence, and everything. So both children like displayed the characters that they were able to share, they were able to recall and retell the stories that were told. Next slide. So another slide, Elena, sorry. So this slide, it's a very short clip that explains, that shows one of a student retelling the story. I'm sorry, it doesn't have a sound. Okay, so when this kid, the boy was telling a story, the other kid was like showing, like acting what really happened. Like they were able to narrate, but also
did you want me to play it? Could you hear it?
I can't hear it, but it's okay.
Again.
I'll just explain.
Try again.
It.
Hold on a second. Let me try again. So let's see.
Leo nitahadithia kisa cha Masanja. Masanja ni mwanafunzi anayesoma darasa la 6.
So I want you guys to listen to what he's saying, though you guys don't understand. But I want you to see what the other boy is doing. Like inside the one who is narrating.
Makundi yao ni uvutaji wa sigara, unywaji wa pombe na mkabaji.
Okay, the
Alifanywa na
boys.
baba yake ya kwamba aache tabia hizo, lakini hakusikia.
Can you pause, please?
Alikwenda kuiba katika duka kubwa.
Okay, so the boy was like narrating how the parents of the kid was advising him not to do the bad things, like not to steal, not to dodge school. But the boy didn't listen to the parents. And in the end, the story is telling us that the boy was captured by police and he was arrested because of the bad doings. But while he's narrating, the other kid is trying to show in actual, like he's doing it in action. Like he's trying to display to people that even if you cannot hear, this is what we mean. So next slide. So the teachers were also given a chance to give out their opinions, and 8 teachers from the 3 schools were interviewed as well. And questions asked was whether they employ traditional storytelling as one of the teaching methods to students, who and what kind of stories are being narrated to the students. And also the teachers were also asked whether the stories narrated help the children to adapt to the society with multicultural, like different foreign cultures. And the finding from teachers, next slide, explained how the storytelling is being applied during teaching practices. And they also explained how the curriculum directs them in telling stories to students on the beginning of each topic. And the stories give out lessons, also improves the listening and understanding skills of kids. So it is not only about the story, it is also helping the kids to improve their listening skills and also the understanding skills of what they are going to be taught. But they also assured that the stories shape the children to face the society with different cultures, with different foreign cultures. So finding from teachers, they also gave us one of the way of how they practice it. Like they introduced the Swahili Club that deals with telling stories and narrating stories, and kids learn a lot of stories from different places and read books like the traditional books and retell the stories. So this is one of the way that they practice the traditional storytelling. So findings from education officers, the education officers were also interviewed on their involvement in the preparation of school curriculum, and they were asked also if they make a close follow-up in the preparation of school curriculum, and they assured that they do make suggestions about the inclusion of storytelling in the school curriculum because they are being consulted during the preparations of the school curriculum, even though they're not the last decision makers. They are just being consulted on what to include in the school curriculum, but they are not the last decision makers. But not only that, but also education officers always makes a follow-up with teachers during different time of school semester to make sure that the teachers follows the lesson plan. And the lesson plan includes the part of the means of teaching, the way of teaching, and stuff like that. Excuse me. So finding from parents, the parents were asked whether they get a chance to tell stories to their children despite their busy schedules. And out of 12 parents, 8 parents complained to have a very busy schedule and did not have enough time to spend with their children. And 4 parents did not have a busy schedule, so they had enough time to share stories with their children, but very few times. So the general findings were that children have had high understanding of storytelling. Teachers and education officers are doing their best in making sure that traditional storytelling is being acknowledged and practiced, but parents are the ones in depth of sharing the stories or teaching the kids about storytelling. Can you go to the discussion part, please?
Yes.
That is a bit.
Thank you so much, Anthonia. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
And I think we'll go straight to Lebanon if you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
I was just trying to think through some of the key elements that were coming out of what Anthonia was saying, and I have to start by apologizing that I may not be in a sense, true to the specific focus of what we're trying to do, I would be very glad to engage with it more. But thank you very much for sharing that work. It's very exciting and interesting work. I wanted to start by reflecting on some of the what one might regard as sort of colonial legacies in terms of particular forms of dispossession and erasure that are experienced in the sort of introduction of new forms of social relations and regimes of ordering the everyday in these specific settings that live with those inheritances of the colonial. And I'm trying to think of your intervention in sort of using traditional storytelling as in one sense, a recuperative mechanism that tries to reclaim some of the collective, collaborative and iterative elements of traditional storytelling, where an author as a central character doesn't exist per se, but the telling and the production of these stories happens in secular and shared and in a way socially reproductive spaces, which is very interesting when you then point to parents who say they have very busy schedules and actually don't have time to tell stories to their children, which would not have been part of a traditional setting where storytelling would be a more collective and communal activity that is not centered around a very specific ordering of the day, where it's saying, oh, you go to school, you go with your parents, tell you a story. I think I was also trying to think about the sort of intersections of the local context and sort of transnational, what we might regard as global situations. I mean, you started by talking about how the children are open to these international influences, and I mean, they're not in of themselves pernicious, and that, you know, it's important to share with them or teach them the sort of traditional culture. And I was thinking in that specific vein that it's important to, as you showed, is that these traditional forms of storytelling are not static. It's not, that's why I thought of it as a recuperative thing, but looking to the future. It's not as if you're going to sort of dig up something that is in situ and exists in this moment as it used to at some point, or is it's imagined to have existed, but that these are active processes of both, in a sense, narrativizing orally, but also enacting the story in the present, in terms of how life is lived and imagined. Of course, they are the moral, didactic, and philosophical elements that exist in different forms of storytelling. I'm very interested in Zimbabwean folklore. I mean, there is, of course, the tension around the sort of moral and didactic elements of those stories and how they want to shape a specific moral economy, which in certain settings, gerontocracy becomes very important, and these age sort of classifications and how children are to be instructed and power deployed becomes very interesting in these forms of storytelling. I think the last thing I had written down, I think, was about care, was about how in a space in which the sort of forms of social relations have been transformed and there's been an introduction of new regimes of ordering the everyday. This kind of storytelling with children can create, forge, or complement spaces of care and other forms of social relations in which the children learn to share each other's worlds and also imagine themselves as part of a larger community. And so anyway, so I can blah blah on. Those were my sort of key immediate thoughts as you're presenting. I'll stop there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lennon. And Anthonia, did you want to respond to that immediately while we see if other people have questions?
Can I receive another question?
Are you would like to go ahead right with the questions? Okay, sure. Maybe can I start with a couple of questions? The question I had is, especially Lennon, when you were talking about folklore, I mean, that is not a word we hear in every country anymore. And if you go to the folklore library of some of the university libraries, they are part of the anthropology section. So something that was in the past that is no longer living in some communities. And I do wonder what is taking the place of this kind of folklore. And in terms of the intergenerational side of it, also to what extent, Anthonia, would you need to involve kind of grandparents and the wider family who might have the time that you're talking about? So I don't know if you want to say anything about that or something else, and then we can maybe move to some of the comments in the chat.
Okay, about the folklore part, it's as you said, it's something that used to exist but doesn't exist anymore. But we have so much to learn about. We have so much to learn on what has been existing. And remember, the ones that what have been existing is the natural environment, like it's our actual environment. The one that we are living currently is the one that has been modified. So since it used to live, that means it has so much to give, it has so much to teach to the current generation. And as Lennon said, that it's some sort of colonial forms that transformed us from our own way of doing things into the new ways of doing things, that we adapted the new ways of doing things and left our own ways of doing things. I thought maybe it could be better if we we adapted our own ways, our own traditional ways, something that used to live, and like merge it to what is happening currently and how we do it currently, and maybe we could have something. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question correctly or I.
Yeah, no, I think maybe some people will pick up on the idea what is our own traditional ways might mean.
Okay.
Especially in mixed societies, but that's a good start.
Okay. Historically. Yeah. Okay. Historically, we had our own way of doing things. Like we had our own way of worshiping. We had our own way of our traditional way of marriage ceremonies. We used to have our own ways of raising baby. We have this traditional way of naming children. Like, for example, there are tribes that when you name a child, you must make a ceremony, and maybe you have to kill a goat or something, and you have to erase all those bad lucks that the parents had or the clan had by killing that goat and naming a child. So that was our own way of doing things. But since when the colonial reforms came or introduced in our country, we adapted in a very Christianity way of baptizing kids, like believing that we are erasing the bad luck that our co-parents had. But that is the colonial form of doing things, but we had our own way of doing things, of which it wasn't so bad, because in Christianity we use water, and in our tradition we use blood. so it's not that bad, but we could still practice our own way, our own traditional way of doing things. But also I can say maybe the styles of doing things, maybe eating style, when we adapt, each person has to have his or her own plate, because we are scared we could have the contamination of some sort of diseases. But remember, our great parents used to eat in the same plate, and they didn't have that disease, the contamination of diseases, and they lived. And with that, doing that, it helped in shaping, in making the family relationship very stronger, compared to the one that we practice, like everybody has to take the plate and move maybe to the side and sit and eat. It is creating some sort of not so family bonding, which is not so good. Maybe I can say it's not so good. Yeah. So our way of doing the things as a group and the introduction of new ways of doing things as individually, maybe the way of doing as a group was our way of doing things, our traditional way of doing things.
Thank you, Anthonia. You've just introduced a whole series of kind of new openings in that, but I will not respond to them directly because Gara has put something in the chat. So Gara, if you can unmute your mic, if you can, that would be great. And then if Javern will go to you next. Garak? Yeah, great.
Yes, Helena, thank you for having me. Do you hear me? I may not have a strong connection. Do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the nice presentation, and especially the examples that you just told us. What I'm thinking is that this storytelling is very important tool in the camp, especially in the case of so I really, but what I'm thinking is that focusing on the traditional aspect to have related to colonization, if we stick to our religion, we may lose the dynamics. So I don't know what you think about that. I believe that storytelling is good, but it has its own versions, and the dynamics should be there.
Okay, Garrett.
So what do you think to that one? Should we stick to the past tradition and we just tell our again, or there should be open grow from their past experience? Thank you.
Thank you for this excellent question. Anthonia, did you manage to get all of that? Yeah, you can respond to that? Great.
Yes, I managed to get the last part of whether we should stick to our own traditional way or should we adapt a new way of doing things.
I think
Is
also,
right?
Gara, I think Gara was also saying that there's multiple versions of stories as well. So he was, I think, Gara, if I'm right, because you went out a little bit, that there's both multiple versions and whether it's always good to stick to traditional or is the story constantly reinvented. I think that might be going to what Lennon was also saying. And that's, I think, what the dynamism side of it may be that Gara is referring to.
Okay. So what should we stick to? According to what I've been hearing, the new stories that we hear, most of them are from TV cartoons and from, I can say, cinemas that kids watch or we elders watch. They have some sort of relation, but when we go to the actual environment, they are not from our own environment. They are most from the foreign environment. So we hear them, we like practice them, they teach us, but they teach us not what we live and we face every day. If it was for me, I would say we should stick to our own traditional stories and also learn some new things of how to adapt to maybe the foreign environment in the new stories. But we should stick to our own because they both teaches us how to deal with different issues. But we should preserve the old one and learn from the new one. So we should some sort of practicing both or listening to both stories. But our traditional ones should be preserved because the future generation has to hear them and has to see them. And remember, it's storytellings are the heritage. So heritage should be preserved and the stories should be preserved because they carry a very large part or they are the heritage. So they should know where they come from through the stories. And about the story, the foreign stories that have been narrated or something, it's best if we learn few things about them.
Yeah, so those are quite challenging, I think, ways of thinking between the two of you. So that's really good. Javert has a question next, and then if Barak, I think, oh no, Elizabeth Kiazike has something in the chat after that, and then Baraka. So if we start Javert with you, that would be great if you unmute yourself. Unmute, Javert, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. If I can unmute from here. Okay, great. We can hear you now.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Hello.
Okay, okay. I really appreciate for the presentations. Anthonia, I saw you took us through the findings. You took us through the findings, and you said me about the response of the parents. And I have a concern on the response of the parents, where you said like parents have been saying like they're so busy, they have some tight schedule that they couldn't even have some time to give like storytelling to the kids, and this is one of the things that makes even a gap in for the present generation, like to come up or to have a clue on our cultural issues or aspects. So I wanted to understand from you, like what did you have, or what do you have in your study, like something or a way in which that it can help to sensitize parents like on these issues, particularly so as to give that sensitization of culture and all that, because these things have been dying and all that. So, and that probably the coming generation wouldn't have like some clues about the past and all that. Yeah,
Okay, thank
all.
you. Thank you so much for the question you asked about the parents. As you all know, our African way, our traditional way of families, how families were meeting and how families were like doing things is that during the evening, they would sit around the fire, and the eldest one would narrate stories to the kids. And with that, maybe it was because they had maybe a lot of work to do, they had ample time, or there were no electronics that they could all concentrate on the electronics and not like having the family time. So I tried to ask them what was really wrong that they didn't have that family time and storytelling time. And they said it was due to work, and maybe kids would come back home and have a lot of assignments. And as you know, some of the kids are waking up very early in the morning and had to board school buses. So when they get back, they only have to do assignments, maybe watch a little bit of cartoon and go to sleep. But at the same time, parents have to work maybe overtime. They come home, they go home late, and some of them, when they go home, maybe they're tired, and they cannot attend, or they cannot sit and talk to the kids. So what I thought, or what I did, or what I have been writing on how to solve that, is that I will be archiving these stories, and I'll take most of the CDs, I'll send them to the National Museum of Tanzania. After recording the stories that have been narrated by students, and some of them have been narrated by teachers, and some of them have been narrated by elders. And with that, I'm also looking forward to find those elders that have lots of stories, and I'll ask them to narrate the stories, and we'll put it in an electronic way, maybe a CD or flash, that the kids will have a chance to listen to those stories generation after generation. So we lost the generation of parents, and we lost the generation of adults. So it will be a little bit difficult to start maybe imparting that thing to people when they are elders or when they are adults already, but we'll be dealing with the kids. So the kids will be listening to those stories and listening, and they'll be updated maybe from time to time. And when they grow up, they'll be told, or they'll have that knowledge of sharing the stories with their kids. So we have, because we missed this age, the adult age, maybe we should be dealing with the grassroots, the children, that we should raise them, we should groom them in that style of narrating stories. So if they missed the stories from their real parents, then they should be getting them from the elders who have a lot of stories that were recorded and were kept in electronics, and they will be having a chance to hear the stories.
Thank you, Anthonia. Elizabeth has another question now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, Antonio, for that wonderful presentation. I had already put part of the question in the chat. Sorry, I joined in a little late because we are in semester. But my question will be, who decides the kind of story to tell? I come from Uganda, and I know that we have various stories for different activities or for instilling different cultural aspects. So what I'm saying, this is a very wonderful project, but like say you're going to make the CDs and so on. Are you going to arrange them based on the kind of activity or the kind of cultural aspect that you would want to instill? Because in my culture, I know that there are stories that are associated with hard work. They say, okay, they tell these stories to encourage the children to be hardworking. Those that will instill some other good mannerisms in them and so on. Some of them are specific based on the culture. Uganda is multi-ethnic in that different ethnic groups have different stories that they use. So in this case, what kind of stories are you focusing on? Because I find this really, really huge, and maybe it's something that you can keep working on, but it's really interesting and I agree that this is really endangered because now children will just move to the cartoons and all that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. So as I can recall from when our elders were narrating stories, it was mostly based on the, I can say, event or maybe a certain incidents that happened. For example, if a kid, maybe during the afternoon, the kids were playing, then one kid maybe bullied another kid and the elder saw it, or the other kids went to report to the elder. Then the elder, during story time, he will use that incident that happened during the afternoon to teach the kids. But those that were those days when they had that ample time and they had the time of listening and telling all those stories. But when I'm preparing these narrations, first, during the recording, I'll have to face different elders with different knowledge. For example, we have those elders that are from maybe iron smelting societies that will have their own ways, their own stories of teaching the children. Maybe I'll also face the farmers. I'll also face the ones that maybe were gold miners or something, the ones that are really faced, or maybe they were traditional healers. With those different stories that I can say now culture as well, practices, the different practices. With all those, I'll get different stories. And since the kids will get a chance to visit those places in different time or periods of time, then they'll have multiple stories to listen, and they'll have different stories to share when they grow up. Because the CDs will be distributed in schools, but they will also be kept in the museum. So because in the National Museum of Tanzania, we receive a lot of children from almost every school in Tanzania. So most of children visit the museum. So when they visit, they will get a chance to listen. So as they listen to those stories that were arranged in different aspects, then it will help them maybe use them later on to narrate to their to the kids and to their children and the kids that do not get a chance to hear those stories because they share.
Thank you, Anthonia. That's a very dynamic and passionate response to Going Future. And I think if I just hand over to Lennon for maybe one final question or comment, and then we can start looking towards the concluding the session. Thanks, Lennon.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthonia. Thank you, Lena. I was just going to say that I am hearing a desire for what may be called traditional modes of storytelling, and practices of storytelling to be integrated into the contemporary and to be part of how we tell stories in the present, such that these stories are traditional, not in the sense that, again, they are located in some sort of static past, but that they are actively part of our conversation and storytelling now. So whether these stories are being told through digital means, whether they are integrated into a cartoon, I'm also trying to think of the value of the story, not solely in the mode of its telling, but also in the sorts of, for instance, ecological relationships that were embedded in those stories. In the moments of ecological collapse, what does traditional storytelling enable us to do and how we relate to those environments? But also in relation to human degradation and sort of hyper-capitalism that is taking us through a slow apocalypse. What forms of solidarity, as you say in K, are possible? But I was also just going to quickly say, where then do we go into the future? What sorts of work are you imagining in this sort of imagining futures where we're going, where we're taking it? Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lennon. That's a very good question. So about the mode of storytelling that maybe we should be using now, or we have been using. At first, when the elders were telling stories, they would have a certain dress, like they would prepare a very an environment for telling stories. Like they'll be around bonfire. Then the elder will sit on a very short chair or something, a stool, and he'll be dressing or she'll be dressing in a certain cloth that will have this stick showing that he's the elder, he's the oldest of all, and also there will be fire, and kids will be sitting around the fire. So at first we had that kind of environment, and sometimes some societies used to make stories in the forest or in a very, as you said, the nature of the environment is different, used to be different. And each environment displayed what kind of story was being told. If they were making stories about maybe a rabbit or something, then they would make it around bushes or something because the rabbit lives in that area. But if it's a normal maybe home stories, then they will make it around the house, but mostly the stories were made around outside the house. So since due to the change of environment and technology, we cannot take kids and send them to those places and make them stay and listen to the stories, we would love to find that person who could dress like that elder during those days and imitate the same thing as how it used to be done. And we'll be recording that thing. So when we'll be showing the kids, I'll be there because I'll be at the National Museum of Tanzania. I'll be there narrating to them, explaining to them what the story is, storytelling is, how it used to benefit them, but also the actual environment will be seen from that video. And the children will be learning that due to the change of technology or change of environment, they couldn't do it in that actual environment, but they'll be seeing the actual environment from the video. So that's how it will be done. And so where do we go from where we are right now? As I told you that we have a gap, a very huge gap on practicing these things, because most of our elders maybe we're not, okay, I can say they are more educated and they have a lot of things on their plates to do, and they didn't give us a chance to listen to the stories, and they did not pass that culture of telling stories. So we also as adults cannot do that to our children. But for the few people who are aware of it as one of an endangered thing, then we should be teaching those kids, we should grooming those kids and help them at least have that thing of sharing stories. It doesn't have to be in the museum, it doesn't have to be on the bushes or maybe with bonfire, but with normal, we can employ that in their mind, that they will be sharing the stories, their own myth and stuff like those, the songs, even with their fellow students or their fellow kids when playing or something like that. So since we missed that part of really practicing in actual environment, then at least we should see what the trend is. Like, where we have to move with the technology, we have to move with the change, but we shouldn't let the stories maybe disappear. We should archive them and show the kids, the children, the ones that are in the age of adaptation and something like that, adapting the new environment and things. So we should help them understand, and we should help them learn what the storytelling is, how they were told, but also understand the stories so they can be able to share them to their kids. So, for example, I am an adult, but I remember. Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm conscious that people might have to go in a bit. I don't want to lose too many before we end.
It's okay. It's okay.
But you've raised I think a lot of interesting and challenging issues around the balance between digital or not in situ storytelling. So things that are from the screen or things that are taken out of some kind of environments where the stories may have lived. And perhaps, I mean, the digitizing, I also just direct you also to the chat where there's been a really good conversation around digitizing perhaps in new ways, and some going on what Lennon and you were saying. How do you bring them into contemporary? But I think perhaps we shouldn't lose some of those environments. And going back to what Gara was asking as well, we have to be, and I think Elizabeth was also asking a bit, we have to be very careful where the traditional doesn't get static, that there's a recognition of change and transformation. So what is aspects should we hold on to? But maybe there are other aspects that might be not a good thing to hold on to. And that is maybe a challenging or controversial thing. But also I think in mixed environments where there isn't an our or challenges what our and we is, there might be multiple traditions. And people don't necessarily feel that some of them are owned as such, but maybe are more global. So I think this is something for maybe another conversation that we can have in the future about this. But before we go, I just want to thank very much Tawny, Paul, Howayda, al-Harithy, Anthonia, yourself, and Lennon Mahishi for starting us off in this wonderful conversation, and for everybody who was able to join. This has been a wonderful launch. And if you would like us to continue sending you links to some of these, if you aren't already on our lists, just join, write to the Imagining Futures team and we will add you to the list. But thank you so much for this rich conversation, and hope to see you in the next dialogues every week from now till about June.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rabia.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see you.
Lena, just a quick question, please.
Yes, Akil.
Can we, the recording, can we get it? Are you going to share it with us?
Yes, the recording will be put online where it will be accessible.
Okay.
Yep.
Good, because I want to send it to Lama because she didn't have.
Yes, I saw she couldn't quite log in. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for joining. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
How accessible is this recording going to be?
Well, I mean, people can write in if they don't want it to be very accessible. That's fine as well. We could just share it with people who requested or are part of the team. So we were hoping to create a folder of dialogues where people could access them, but we're obviously very happy to just limit them if that's what people prefer. Absolutely, Tawny. Seriously.
I'm all about sharing. I'm just a little nervous because this is new research, and I don't want. I've heard horror stories of publishers kind of being like, "Well, this is already out in public, so
right.
You know, it's more that's my concern than that someone would take it."
But we can also put kind of an embargo thing on it until maybe a certain time. We can also do that if that helps. I mean, because your paper isn't necessarily part of that, so that's just been shared with whoever as a group for this. But in terms of presenting the research, I don't think. I mean, that was just a very brief summary. You don't think that would be seen as?
It's probably fine. I'm sure it's fine. Yeah. Put it up. What the hell?
Okay. Baraka, you're also starting the MA, aren't you?
Yes, I'm studying MA here at the University of Dar es Salaam.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it's great that you could join. I don't know if other
Yes.
people who are still around, if you wanted to, I can see Chris there. I don't know if he's gone to Juan. I don't know. Nicholas is still there. I know that. Rebecca, I don't know, but
Yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, it was a very good conversation and it's a nice experience. I am also a part of Imagining Futures. So I hope to learn a lot, but also to share a lot.
yeah.
And indeed, this is a good journey. I appreciate this idea. And indeed, all the topics that I have so far seen have been presented here. They are very, for me, I can call them very sensitive, you know, and they need a lot of care and continuity. They should not end here, especially for this as this one for traditional storytelling. You know, it needs a lot of efforts, but also keen, especially in the methodology. So you can see how these things are going. So for me, I think it's a very nice experience I have ever seen, and I'm proud to be a member of Imagining Futures.
Oh, thank you for that, Baraka. But I really take your very point about the sensitivity of this, because I think there's a lot of positive things, but if I think the lovely thing is we get to think about this together from very different contexts. So this is, I think, in many ways could also be seen as challenging, because I think some of the things presented here, you kind of wonder, how do you transfer that discussion into the environment that I'm familiar with or that you're familiar with, right? Whether it's about street naming or naming at all, the idea of streets and spaces, what is public, what is private, who has the right to decide, but also in terms of storytelling. So it's always the question of what is going to go into the future, but how do we take into account the past that has to change in a way? Yeah. So, but without losing key aspects of it, you know. So I think and absolutely, this is not the end. It's not stopping. This is very much the beginning. So you're joining right at the beginning.
Yeah, sure. And as I have said that indeed you have made good point to underline my comment on sensitivity, and I think this should be taken further. But you know. If we are coming to these issues, one needs to be very keen. And sure, you know, this series of presentation, I think, and I have seen in my email that they should be containing, I think to June, July, somewhere there.
Every Tuesday.
They are very good. Yeah, sure. So when we are coming together, a person has ideas, and he or she can share his or her progress on the project. Then we can shape each other, and we can be giving comments. You know, this let's use this as a ground of sharing, of helping each other, of building up together, so that we can move on. You know, so that we can, the insights that I'm getting from Tawny Paul, or the insight that I'm getting from you, Madam Elena, and other person like Anthonia, they can help me to, okay, I was thinking of this, I was maybe either underestimate or overlook, you see. So the comments will be helping to build this together. And I'm congratulating you very much, and let's join our hands together.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for that. And the MAs will have their own discussion session as well. So that will be great. I think we have to run now, unfortunately, but thank you so much. And for all these comments as well. That's great to know that it's helpful. And we'll see you all next time. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.